And as we begin our meeting tonight, I wish to offer a land acknowledgement by reminding us that we are on the land that have been cared for at least 13,000 years by indigenous people. Most recently, the land had been cared for by the Haudenosaunee, who oversaw this land until they were displaced in the 18th century. Again, I want to thank you for coming to the May meeting of the Broome County Historical Society here in the library. Thank you for coming despite the rain, too wet to golf or garden, so glad you're able to come and join us tonight. I want to thank Board of Trustees member Mike Venuga for providing those mini muffins tonight. Always a board member provides some little snack for us. If you're a member of the Broome County Historical Society, we honor your membership. It's very inexpensive. We're an all-volunteer organization. If you're not a member, we just happen to have membership forms on the table there, just beyond the muffins that I'm sure you can find. If you are a member, you receive our monthly flyer giving more information about the actual program. So think about joining our organization. Think about renewing if you are a member and did get the renewal letter a couple of months ago and haven't renewed yet. Please consider renewing. Also on the back table is a listing of our programs for the year. We only have one more, and that's in June. We do not offer programs in July, August, or December, but it's a blue paper back there, and pick it up if you haven't been at our meetings. You can get an idea of just what kind of programs we do offer in Broome County history. With the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution about to be commemorated, we begin with our first speaker on that period, Mark Burdick, who will share some of that period in Broome County. He will focus first on the Sullivan expedition and then offer some information about local Revolutionary War soldiers. There were more than 300 who lived and later were buried in Broome County. Mr. Burdick is a retired engineer with BAE Systems in Endicott, president of the local chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, and also a member of the Mayflower Society. So Mark, let's go to the American Revolution.
All right, thank you, Linda. As Linda noted, since about 2020, well, maybe you didn't know this, but I will point out that since 2020, the SAR Binghamton chapter has supported the grant applications for and installations of 15 different Patriot burials, roadside markers at Southern Tier cemeteries. And I should probably open this up so you can see the screen. That's better. In fact, this past weekend we dedicated one in Harpersville to Ezra Pratt, a veteran of the early Continental Army's Massachusetts line and a Vermont militia unit. On June 7th, we'll dedicate another one in Kirkwood to Elias Bevere, Elias Conklin, and Cornelius Snedeker, who were all in New York or New Jersey militia units. Today, if we have enough time, I'll talk in some detail about a few of the more than 300 Revolutionary War veterans who eventually settled, lived, and are buried here in Broome County. But first, as we continue our commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the decade of the American Revolution, 1773 to 1783, I'd like to discuss the only action of the Revolutionary War to have occurred in what would later become Broome County, the Sullivan Expedition. Before we get too deep into that discussion, though, we should take a look at a few maps to better understand the extent of the colony and the state of New York during the Revolution. So here we have the New York of today, with its 62 counties. And I'd like to think we're all more or less familiar with this map. And you can see Broome County. Let's see if my pointer works here. You can see Broome County down here in the southern tier. Here we have the New York of the Revolution, or more specifically, when New York's Constitution was adopted. 14 counties, including 2 or 3 or maybe even 4, that would later become part of the state of Vermont, and a few more with fuzzy borders that some felt were part of Massachusetts. Notice the western boundary, roughly along this line. So there's Oneida Lake, and there's the boundary. And also notice that Binghamton would be around here per this map. I have a red dot there. So if you look at it carefully, you'll see that in this map, that indicates that it's in Pennsylvania. And it's also within the country of the Six Nations, which is what it says over on this side of the map. This slide highlights a good portion of that western boundary, known as the Fort Stanwix Treaty Line of 1768. Notice that it places the entire Mohawk River Valley in English territory. This map zooms in on the southern tier piece of that treaty line. I've tried to overlay an outline of the current day Broome County and show the current day names of the Iroquois, or more properly, the Haudenosaunee villages of Atsinengo, Oshenang, or Binghamton, Chugnuts, or Vestal, Kunahunta, or Afton, Kukus, or Cookhouse, as some pronounced it, which is deposit, and Ingeren, or Great Bend, Pennsylvania, and Aguaga, near current-day Windsor. So there's the outline of Broome County. I'm not sure how well you can see it in the back, but there's Aguaga, or Anaquaga. As Linda reminded us at the beginning of the meeting, we are on the land that had been cared for at least 13,000 years by indigenous people, most recently by the Haudenosaunee, who oversaw this land until they were displaced in the 18th century. My talk will now get into a significant piece in the history of that 18th century displacement. Aguaga, also called Anaquaga, and spelled many different ways, straddled the Susquehanna River between the current-day towns of Windsor and Colesville, at the hamlet now known as Uaquaga. This early Haudenosaunee, or Five Nations crossroads settlement on the well-traveled Susquehanna River, was one of the southernmost Haudenosaunee villages and home to members of the Oneida. Tuscarora, who had come to the Susquehanna Valley around 1715 after being driven out of North Carolina, created small settlements to the north and south of Anaquaga, and soon after that, the Five Nations became the Six Nations. Sir William Johnson, the future British superintendent of the Indian Affairs for the northern colonies, established a trading post at Anaquaga in the late 1730s, partly because it was strategically located near the shortest distance between the Susquehanna and Delaware rivers. I have another slide here that illustrates that difference a little bit better. And because it was located on the Susquehanna and between the Delaware and Susquehanna rivers, that broadened its influence in the region. Heavily used trails left Anaquaga in all directions. By the mid-1750s, the village was described as a melting pot of Haudenosaunee nations. In 1753, Nanacoke refugees from Virginia also moved to Anaquaga, the same year that Reverend Gideon Hawley came to the village from Stockbridge, Massachusetts, to establish a mission there, and not long before this map was created. In 1768, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was negotiated between Sir William Johnson and representatives of the Six Nations. The British government had hoped that the new boundary might bring an end to the frontier violence, which had become costly and troublesome for them. The Haudenosaunee hoped that the new line might hold back British colonial expansion. However, the line divided British and Indian territories in such a way that left Onaquaga nearly surrounded by the colonial frontier settlements in New York and PA. Because of its strategic location, Onaquaga actually became the hub of a continuing frontier border war, just as America declared its independence from England. Are you getting a little feedback back there? See if that helps. Oops. Even though many of the Oneida and Tuscarora and Onaquaga resolved to remain neutral in the conflict, many pro-British Mohawks who were displaced by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix came to Onaquaga, as did groups of Lenape, or Delaware, and a number of Loyalists. Eventually, the Oneida and Tuscarora sided with the rebellious Whig colonists and left the Onaquaga Valley. But the British persuaded many other Haudenosaunee to take up arms against the Whigs, particularly on the New York frontier. Together from Onaquaga, the Loyalists and Haudenosaunee allies engaged in New York's ongoing frontier war with the rebelling settlers in Tryon County, which included much of the Mohawk Valley, as well as with rebels in Albany, Ulster, and Orange counties. Thayendanegea, also known as Chief Joseph Brant, the unofficial leader of the Six Nation Confederacy and protege of Sir William Johnson, Brant's sister Molly was the wife of Sir William Johnson. He was a native of Canajoharie, but he had lived in Onaquaga over the years. And in 1765, Brant married the daughter of an Onaquaga chief. He described his second home in the village as follows. At Onaquaga, I owned another farm with a comfortable house of squared logs, a flourishing orchard of apple, pear, and peach trees, 50 acres of cleared land, and 15 to 20 head of livestock. I also owned a small island in the river on which improvements were begun. So by the spring of 1778, Onaquaga had gone from being a trading post to a mission post to a military outpost and recruiting station for Crown allied Haudenosaunee with Joseph Brant as their commander. Brant's warriors joined forces with those of Loyalist leaders Sir John Johnson, who was the son of Sir William Johnson, and Major John Butler of Butler's Rangers fame. Together, they conducted frontier attacks for the British, Cobleskill, New York in May of 1778, Springfield, Andrustown, and Lackawanna in New York, and Forty Fort in Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley in July of 1778. German Flats, New York in September, and Peenpack, New York in October of 1778. The raids collected arms and provisions for the British Allies and destroyed rebel settlements and farms across hundreds of miles of frontier and killed scores of Whig sympathizers, both military and civilian. Whig forces made a few reprisal attacks of their own, most notably Colonel Thomas Hartley's raid on Queen Esther's Town near Tioga Point, which is now Athens, Pennsylvania, in September of 1778. Around that same time, New York Governor and Continental Army General George Clinton wrote to General George Washington, Onaquaga is a considerable Indian settlement, not far distant from the frontier settlements, and the principal place for rendezvous for the enemy. And I am persuaded, unless it can be destroyed and the enemy thereby obliged to retire further back into the country, that no force, however formidable, will be able to protect us against their practices. So in early October 1778, the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment, under Colonel William Butler, no relation to John Butler, set out from Middlefort at present-day Middleburg in the Schoharie Valley on an expedition against Onaquaga. The regiment reached the outskirts of Unadilla on October 6, 1778. Scouts came back with a prisoner who informed them that most of the town's approximately 300 residents had fled to Onaquaga. Butler left a detachment at Unadilla to destroy that village, while the rest of his troops continued on to Onaquaga. They reached the town on the evening of October 8th. Like Unadilla, they found it abandoned. The village is approximately 400 inhabitants, also having caught wind of the impending attack. Butler described Onaquaga this way. It was the finest Indian town I ever saw. On both sides of the river, there was about 40 good houses, square logs, shingles, stone chimneys, good floors, glass windows, etc., etc. Over the next 2 days, Onaquaga was completely destroyed. More than 40 houses, a sawmill, and the only grist mill in the area were all burned to the ground. Crops were destroyed, fruit trees cut down, and livestock captured or killed. When they finished, the regiment returned to the Schoharie Valley by way of Unadilla, and on October 10th, they completed its destruction as well. Everything was razed, except for the home of the prisoner who had helped them. The destruction of his principal bases of operation at Onaquaga and Unadilla was a bitter reality for Joseph Brant and proved to be a turning point in the frontier conflict for both sides. Brant, no longer in a position to defend these strongholds and hold on to the ancestral land of his people, went on the offensive and attacked Cherry Valley on November 11, 1778, exacting revenge for his losses. 30 settlers, 14 soldiers were killed. He returned to Onaquaga several times more in the following years, but in its ruined state, it was never the same. For most citizens of the new nation, the Cherry Valley incident in New York was seen as a turning point. The events that occurred there, along with those in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, forced the Continental Congress to ask General Washington to do something to provide some relief on the frontiers. In response, Washington devised a multi-pronged attack to, in his words, not merely overrun, but destroy the Crown-allied Haudenosaunee and their political and military influence, while encouraging friendly Oneida and Tuscarora to support the rebel movement. This pivotal event in the American Revolution was one of the largest coordinated actions of the war. Nearly 25% of the entire Continental Army followed Washington's orders for the mission. Colonel Daniel Brodhead would head up the Allegheny River from Fort Pitt, now Pittsburgh, with his regiment in western Pennsylvania, while Major General John Sullivan, after starting at Easton, Pennsylvania, would go up the Susquehanna River from Wyoming with 3 brigades. Meanwhile, Brigadier General James Clinton, New York Governor George Clinton's brother, would head up the Mohawk from Schenectady with his brigade of 5 regiments, portage 20 miles from Canajoharie to Otsego Lake, then head down the north branch of the Susquehanna River, joining up with Sullivan in Tioga Point, which I mentioned earlier is now Athens, Pennsylvania. From there, they would invade the land of the Haudenosaunee, primarily Seneca and Cayuga lands in the Finger Lakes region. Through the entire mission, the Sullivan expedition would employ irregular tactics of its own, a scorched earth operation that some would later say foreshadowed Sherman's march to the sea 85 years earlier, or later, sorry. On July 31st, 1779, after a month and a half of preparation, Sullivan's 2,300-man army finally left Wyoming with 1,200 pack horses, 800 head of cattle, 8 pieces of artillery, and 120 bateaux. A month earlier, Clinton's brigade had arrived at the south end of Otsego Lake at present-day Cooperstown. There he awaited orders from Sullivan. While they waited, they built a dam on the Susquehanna River's source to give their boats some additional downstream oomph when they received those orders. One way to examine Sullivan's campaign is through the journals of its expedition's leaders, which provide a narrative of the journey. Like many military histories, looking back from the perspective of 246 years, these narratives provide insights that are at once captivating and disturbing, triumphant and tragic. They tell the story from a winner's perspective, the start of one empire and the end of another. Lieutenant Hercules Beatty had arrived in Schoharie the previous summer with his regiment, the same 4th Pennsylvania Regiment that had destroyed Onondaga and Udilla in October in the previous year. Beatty had served in Long Island and White Plains with the New Jersey troops before receiving a commission in the Pennsylvania Regiment. He was then at Brandywine, Germantown, and Valley Forge and Monmouth. After Onondaga and Unadilla, he went on Colonel Goose Van Schaik's expedition against the Onondagas in June of 1779, just before his regiment joined Clinton's brigade on the expedition against the Six Nations. At that point, he was keeping a daily journal. On Monday, August 9th, Clinton's dam was broken. On Wednesday, August 11th, the brigade was in Otsego. On Thursday, the 12th, they had reached Unadilla, and by Friday, the 13th, they were in Conjunto, now Afton. We pick up Lieutenant Beatty's journal the next day as they entered what would become Broome County 27 years later. And actually, I'm going to stop here a second, and you can see the arrows. That's the Susquehanna River. And that's the Delaware River. And you can see Onondaga, there it's spelled one of the many different ways. That's the closest point between the two rivers. And that's why it was such an important location, because the rivers were so close together there. So let's pick up Lieutenant Beatty's journal entry. Saturday, August 14th. Arrived at the fording 2 miles from Onondaga about 2 o'clock. The ford being too deep to wade, crossed in our boats to the east side, went over a high hill and got to Onondaga at 3 o'clock, where we encamped on a very pretty ground. This town was one of the neatest Indian towns on the Susquehanna. It was built on each side of the river with good log houses with stone chimneys and glass windows. It likewise had a church and a burying ground and a great number of apple trees. We likewise saw the ruins of an old fort, which formerly was here many years ago. The Indians abandoned this town last fall when they heard of our detachment coming to destroy it. They had but just left it when we came in it. We did not catch any of them, but burnt their town to ashes, and the detachment returned. Over the next 2 days, Beatty continued with some journal entry details that may have a familiar ring to us today, especially today. Sunday, August 15th, and they were still in Onondaga at this point. Very heavy dew this morning. Went on guard. The Army remained at Onondaga today. Quiet, no news stirring, as I hear of particular. Monday, August 16th. This morning, a very heavy dew and fog, which is customary in this country. Was relieved of my guard, and the day proved exceeding warm today. A heavy shower of rain this afternoon. At 12 o'clock, Major Church with the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment went out 5 or 6 miles to meet 400 or 500 militia, who we expected to join us here, but he returned in the evening and saw nothing of them. Major James Norris had been a captain of the Continental Army's 2nd New Hampshire Regiment under then Colonel Enoch Poor. He saw action early in the Saratoga campaign at Hubbardton and Castleton, both now in Vermont, and was promoted to major in the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment. In the early summer of 1779, the 3rd New Hampshire joined the Sullivan expedition, coming up from Wyoming. He was part of the detachment under General Poor that Sullivan sent up the Susquehanna to unite with General Clinton's brigade. This is where we pick up Norris's journal. Tuesday, August 17th. We marched early this morning, proceeded 12 miles to Owego, an Indian town which was deserted last spring after planting. About the town is many fruit trees and many plants and herbs that are common in our part of the country. Here is a large body of clear intervale covered with grass. And to clarify, an intervale is a low-lying, typically fertile tract of land along a stream or river. Our march today was very severe and fatiguing, especially for the left column to which I belong. Of course, that was the most severe. As we had to pass several steep hills and morasses. And to clarify, a morass is a muddy or boggy ground. I'll probably share some of these photos in more detail online on our Facebook page, because some of these are very interesting diagrams. Meanwhile, back upstream with Lieutenant Beatty, we marched off from Onondaga this morning at 8 o'clock and proceeded down the river 3 miles to one of the Tuscarora towns, which was burnt by our detachment last fall. Here we waded the river to the west side and went 1 mile when we came to another of the Tuscarora towns called Shawangto at the current village of Windsor. So it's a little further south, and it's in the area that the village of Windsor is located now. It consisted of 10 or 12 houses, which we burnt. We then marched over a very barren mountainous country, 10 or 12 miles, and came to a Tuscarora settlement called Ingaren, consisting of 5 or 6 houses, but a good deal scattered. And now, I know this map shows Ingaren near current-day Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, but as I understand it, it was actually closer to what's now Great Bend, Pennsylvania. We encamped at the lower end of the settlement after burning the houses. Here they had planted a good deal of corn, potatoes, etc., which we destroyed. A few yards in front of our company's encampment ground, there was a tan fat farm with several hides in a tanning, which the soldiers got. Marched today 15 miles. The next day, back downstream with Major Norris. Wednesday, August 18th. We marched early this morning and proceeded to Chocona, the remains of a large Indian town, which has likewise abandoned this summer. Chocona, also known as Chuknuts, was a town of numerous houses, mostly on the south side of the Susquehanna at the mouth of Big Chocona Creek, which everyone here probably knows is Vestal today. We found plenty of cucumbers, squashes, turnips, etc. We found about 20 houses, which we burned. Our day's march has been more severe than yesterday, as we had bad hills and swamps. One swamp of about 2 miles so covered with large pines, standing and lying, which appeared as though several hurricanes had been busy among, since which a tremendous growth of bushes about 20 feet high has sprung up, so very thick as to render the passing through them impractical by any troops, but such as nothing but death can stop. At sunset, we were very agreeably alarmed by the report of a cannon up the river, which was supposed to be General Clinton's evening gun. In the meantime, further upstream, Lieutenant Beatty's unit proceeded. marched off from Ingeren 7 o'clock through a very fine, rich country, very well timbered, but poorly watered. Arrived at the Shenango River in current-day Binghamton at 4 o'clock, where we forded it, about 4 feet deep and almost as wide as the Susquehanna, but not so deep. As soon as we got over, we halted, and Major Parr, with 100 men, went up the river to destroy the Shenango town, we know it now as Otsoningo, which lay 4 miles up the river. When we got there, we found the town was burnt. It consisted of about 20 houses. It seems when the Indians evacuated it last winter, they destroyed it. That was his guess. We returned and found the army encamped 2 miles below the Shenango River, marched today 22 miles, and burnt several Indian houses on the road. This evening came up the river 2 runners who informed us that General Poor, with 1,000 men, was within 9 miles of us and coming to meet us. That General Sullivan lay at the mouth of the Tioga, which is now known as, that portion of it is now known as the Chemung River, and that he had sent part of his army up to Chemung, which they destroyed. They had returned to General Sullivan with the loss of 9 men killed and some more wounded in small skirmishing. The Indians had taken all of their things from Chemung, excepting a few cattle, which our people got. Thursday, August 19th. Major Norris reported the union of the 2 armies with the following entry in his journal. Our troops were put in motion very early this morning. After marching about 1 mile, General Poor received an express from General Clinton, informing him that the latter expected to be here by 10 o'clock a.m. this day, in consequence of which we returned to our old encampment. General Clinton joined us at 10 o'clock with 2,000 men, including officers, boatsmen, etc. He has 208 bateaux with provisions, ammunition, etc. After mutual congratulations and compliments, the whole proceeded down the river to Owego, with General Clinton's army in front and General Poor's in the rear, and encamped. This evening, the town of Owego was made a bonfire of to grace our meeting. And with that, the Sullivan Expedition's travels through the future Broome County had ended. The 2 brigades spent about 6 days accomplishing their mission here, August 14th through August 19th, including part of a day spent in what is now northern Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. By Sunday, August 22nd, Clinton had arrived with Poor at the temporary fort they'd named Sullivan, located in Tioga, Athens, Pennsylvania. The largest engagement of the campaign occurred in Newtown, New York, on August 29th, where the Haudenosaunee attempted their final stand after losing to Sullivan's troops in New Chemung 2 weeks earlier. They numbered around 800. It was one of the largest groupings of Native American warriors to stand against the American army in the history of the United States. Most were Haudenosaunee under Brant, but there were some Loyalist Rangers under John Butler and 8 Crown soldiers. The combined armies of Sullivan and Clinton proved too much for them, though, and the combined Haudenosaunee and Loyalist forces withdrew. Over the next month and a half, the combined armies would penetrate into the Six Nations territory as far as Little Beard's town, the Seneca's Geneseo, or Geneseo, in the Genesee Valley. According to Sullivan's account of the campaign, 40 villages were destroyed, along with all of their orchards, crops, and winter stores. Other major Seneca settlements destroyed include Catherinestown, or Montour, and Canadasaga, or Seneca Castle. Important Cayuga towns that were destroyed included Goyogwen, or Cayuga Castle near Union Springs, and Chonadoke, or Aurora. Colonel Peter Gansevoort's 3rd New York Regiment was also ordered to take every male Mohawk in Tiantantalago. He was asked to take every male Mohawk there prisoner on his return to Schenectady. Tiantantalago, or Lower Mohawk Castle, was about 6 miles west of current-day Amsterdam, New York, on the Mohawk River. The rest of the expedition saw a common pattern. Towns and villages they entered were empty, sometimes vacated days, and sometimes only hours before. Diaries often commented on the beauty of the surroundings, how fine the town was, and the excellence of the crops. And then the troops followed their orders and destroyed them. In the end, most of the Haudenosaunee refugees retreated to the Great Lakes in Canada, seeking protection from the British. The following year, there were Haudenosaunee and Loyalist attacks from Fort Oswego and Fort Niagara on settlers in the Mohawk Valley. But for all intents and purposes, the Haudenosaunee Confederation was already broken. The campaign had effectively dispossessed the natives of their homelands and opened up the former Six Nations territory and points west, like Ohio, western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, and Kentucky, to post-war settlements and what most citizens saw as their new nation's manifest destiny. Today, the Sullivan expedition presents us with a much more complex and less clear-cut picture than the one painted in the late 19th and early 20th century. Independent researcher and 18th century living historian Tim Abbott summarized it this way. It was a dirty war on the frontier, certainly more difficult for modern memory to wrap in patriotic bunting as it was in the 19th century. In their own time, there were few who described the campaign as heroic. There was little contemporaneous doubt, however, that it was necessary. It is important to witness an event in our War of Independence that defies simple characterization and to acknowledge those who took part in it as more complex than simple patriots. So I'm looking at the time, and that was really the first part of my presentation for this evening. I don't know if we'll have enough time to cover everything that I wanted to cover in the second part of my presentation, but so I could end it right here, or I could move on and do the first several minutes of the second part, because like the slide says, and just to be clear, the second part is a snapshot of about 10 biographies of the over 300 veterans who lived and are buried here in Broome County. So if I don't finish it, I could do some of it next week online, and I can pass that information on through the Historical Society. I could also just do the first couple of minutes here, and or I could take questions because I see a hand back here. And
next Wednesday, Mark Kay's doing her presentation here from 6 to closing.
Yours is not here, yours is on.
Yeah, mine.
But the thing is, that you're doing, they're both going on at the same time.
Okay, I can move it to a different time. I didn't see that on the schedule, so I didn't.
Well, it's same room, but it's a
Right.
presentation about basically what happened to Susquehanna Street. How
Okay.
it used to be a thriving community and got destroyed.
Okay.
Keep talking tonight about the.
Yeah.
Okay.
biographies.
All right. I can do that. Let me get a drink first. So after the conclusion of the American Revolution, Western New York was divided among many land speculators. I'm not going to get into some of the controversial ways in which that occurred, but among those speculators who acquired land, much of it from Native Americans, in the future Broome County were the following. James Wilson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence for Pennsylvania and later Supreme Court Justice appointed by Washington. Robert Lettuce Hooper Jr., Deputy Quartermaster General and later member of the Vice President, later a member and Vice President of the New Jersey Legislative Council. And of course, William Bingham, Secretary of the Committee of Secret Correspondence, financier and procurer of arms, munitions, and supplies for the Continental Army, and later advisor to Hamilton and a U.S. Senator. The Boston Purchase Company, made up of 11, later 60 investors who exercised Massachusetts' right to purchase property rights from the local Indians and allowed them to, by the 1786 Treaty of Hartford, which settled the western boundary disputes between Massachusetts and New York. There's some of the boundary arrangements that I was talking about earlier. John Jay, President of the Continental Congress, negotiator of the Treaty of Paris, author of 5 Federalist Papers, and the first Chief Justice of the United States. James Clinton, the Brigadier General that we talked about earlier, and the second in command on the Sullivan-Clinton expedition, and Isaac Melcher, Colonel and Barracks Master General of the Pennsylvania Militia and the Continental Army. Robert Morris, another financier of the Revolution, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. William Floyd, Colonel in the militia and signer of the Declaration of Independence from New Jersey. William Stephen Smith, a son-in-law of John Adams. And Robert Harper, Alexander Hamilton's mathematics teacher at King's College, New York State Assemblyman, and Deputy Secretary of the State for New York during and after the American Revolution, and the namesake of Harpersville and Harper College. Revolutionary War veterans who settled in Broome County brought with them the memories of nearly every battle and campaign of the war, including the Boston Tea Party, Bunker Hill, Lexington, Saratoga, Bennington, Dobbs Ferry, the Battle of Wyoming, and many more, up to the victory at Yorktown and Washington's march into New York City. There were members of Washington's and Lafayette's Guard, as well as the guards that for the captured Major John Andre. There were Green Mountain Boys, Minutemen, and Marines under Captain John Paul Jones. It's also interesting to note that many veterans of one regiment settled together in Broome County. The towns of Lisle and Windsor in particular are a location that lots of men from the same regiment settled. In all, there were over 300 veterans who relocated here. Some 130 came from parts unknown, but at least 65 came from Connecticut, at least 52 from elsewhere in New York, and 46 or more from Massachusetts. There were at least 9 originally from New Jersey, but perhaps only 1 from Pennsylvania, while a dozen or so came from New Hampshire, Vermont, and Rhode Island. Of these, we know where about 80% of them settled, and where about 2/3 of them are buried. Caleb Hyde. On May 10, 1775, Caleb marched with his company from Lenox, Berkshire County, Massachusetts, to Ticonderoga, New York. He was later commissioned a major in Colonel Benjamin Simon's militia regiment, the Berkshire Boys, which joined General Stark in actions at the Battle of Bennington in August 1777. They also helped reinforce Colonel John Brown's regiment at the Second Battle of Saratoga at Bemis Heights in October of 1777. He returned to the area in October 1781 as a lieutenant colonel to reinforce the Continental Army at Stillwater under General Stark. After the close of the war, he became a general in the Massachusetts militia and was sheriff of Berkshire County from 1781 to 1791, helping to deal with the final incidents of Shays' Rebellion in 1787. He moved to New York in 1795, probably with Continental Army and fellow Shays suppressor, Major General John Patterson, whose eldest son had married Caleb's daughter. He lived in Heights Settlement, near what is now Whitney Point, served terms as an assemblyman, as a state senator, and died on Christmas in 1820. Caleb Hyde is buried in Riverside Cemetery in Whitney Point, and we put a marker up there a number of years ago with help from Debbie Abbey over there. William Weston, who enlisted initially as a fifer with the New Jersey troops, participated in the battles of Long Island and Brandywine Creek. He wintered at Valley Forge, fought at Monmouth Courthouse and at Yorktown with the 1st New Jersey Regiment. He also participated in the Sullivan Expedition and was one of 9 sent by Sullivan to meet Clinton before he left Otsego Lake. Weston's discharge certificate was signed at the headquarters of the Continental Army's final encampment at the New Windsor Cantonment by His Excellency George Washington, Esquire. By 1798, Weston and fellow expedition comrade John Rush, who was the nephew of Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration and Surgeon General of the Continental Army, moved to Willow Point in Vestal. He died on December 15, 1848, and is buried in the Vestal Park Cemetery near the United Methodist Church on Main Street in Vestal. Elias Bevere, he was the great-grandson of a French, and this is why I always pronounce his name Bevier, was the grandson of a French Huguenot. He moved his family from Ulster County to Shenango in Broome County around 1815. Beviere's 1832 pension application and 1833 update was never fully proven, perhaps because his name and date recollections weren't always accurate, but it is an interesting read. He was in an Ulster County militia regiment at New Paltz under Captain Jacob Hasbrook, which helped in putting down a rising of the Tories under Jacobus Rose, or Rusa, and Jacob Middaugh, 2 noted leaders of the Tories and disaffected in that county. The company also went on frequent excursions to the western frontier between 1775 and 1777, while under Captain John Hardenberg and Colonel John Canteen's regiment, he was detached to convey baggage of the Convention Army, which was Burgoyne's army after its surrender at Saratoga. He took their baggage from New Windsor to Sussex Courthouse in New Jersey. Late in the war, while still serving under Captain Deo in the same regiment, his unit returned to the Western Frontier mission and continued its attempts to drive the Native Americans back into such places as Fantine-Kill, Lurin-Kill, Wawarsing, Marbletown, Kakiat, Ramapo, and Shalongo. Bevere died in Conklin on July 28, 1838, and is buried in the Kirkwood Cemetery. And he is one of the ones that we're honoring with a Patriot Barrels marker on June 7th. Joshua Whitney. Joshua Whitney's father, Lieutenant Tom of Claverack, was killed in 1766 when Joshua was just 18 during disputes that occurred around Nobletown, now North Hillsdale, New York, where he and other squatters had bought land that was claimed by both New York, the Van Rensselaer and Livingston families, and Massachusetts. So there's the border coming into play again. During the American War of Independence, Joshua served as an officer in the 9th Regiment, East Claverack District, Albany County Militia, under Colonel Peter Van Ness, later under Brigadier General Robert Van Rensselaer. His youngest brother, William, was a private in the same regiment, and his youngest brother, William, is one of my great-great-grandparents. By early 1779, he was a camp captain. The 9th Regiment served regularly in Upper Hudson and Mohawk Valleys, prior to his involvement in resisting and delaying Burgoyne's march that eventually ended in Saratoga. He was in the skirmishes called the Battle of Egremont, a civil war with local Tories. During the Saratoga campaign, he also skirmished with Indians at a breastwork at Moses Creek with Benedict Arnold. Afterwards, the Albany militia became engaged in the frontier war in the Mohawk Valley, keeping check on the Tories and Indians. Perhaps the most significant Mohawk Valley engagement came during Brant and Johnson's Burning of the Valleys campaign of October 1780 at the Battle of Clark's Field. Shortly after the war, Joshua and William moved their families in 1787 to their new home near the old Indian castle of Otsiningo, becoming squatters once again on the land owned by the Boston Purchase Company, near what several other veterans, including Joseph Leonard and William Rose, had set up their homes. Joshua became an early judge of what would become Tioga County in 1791, and Brother William would eventually become the county's militia's brigadier general. Joshua contracted yellow fever on one of his many trips to Philadelphia in 1793 and died en route home in Wind Gap, Pennsylvania, where he was unceremoniously buried. On that trip, he had been in contact with William Bingham and was supposedly returning home with papers that gave him the management of Bingham's patent. This title was passed on to his son, Joshua. The father's grave was later moved to Spring Forest Cemetery in Binghamton. Major General John Patterson was the highest ranking officer of the Continental Army to move here. Patterson was originally from Farmington, Connecticut, where he practiced law and taught school. In 1774, he and his family moved to Lenox, Massachusetts, where he soon took up politics. In 1775, he was a colonel of a Berkshire County militia regiment that took part in the siege of Boston. His regiment became part of the Continental Army and saw action at Bunker Hill. It also crossed the Delaware on Christmas Eve in 1776 and attacked Trenton. In late 1777, Brigadier General Patterson commanded a brigade of Horatio Gates' army at the battles of Saratoga. In 1778, Patterson's brigade was at the Battle of Monmouth, and by winter of that year, he took command at West Point. He remained in that region for the rest of the war. For 7 months in 1783, Private Robert Shirtliff, also known as Deborah Sampson, was an orderly for Patterson. In 1791, Patterson and his wife Elizabeth brought some of their children, some grown, with them to Lisle in the northern part of the Boston Purchase. The Pattersons built their home at the confluence of the Otselic and Tyopneoga rivers, near the current site of Aiello's restaurant. Soon after, the area was referred to as Patterson's Settlement, or Patterson's Point. In later years, it took the name of the residents who moved up from the Shenango Point area in 1802 and became known as Whitney Point. After serving in several town, county, and state positions, Patterson was elected to Congress, serving from 1803 to 1805. In 1806, he became Chief Justice of the new Broome County. Patterson died in Lisle in 1808 at the age of 64. He was buried at Riverside Cemetery in the current-day Whitney Point. In 1892, Patterson's remains and those of his wife Elizabeth were removed and reinterred near their 2 daughters in Lenox, Massachusetts, by his great-grandson. John Conklin. Early in the Revolution, John Conklin, who grew up in Cohocton, Ulster, which is now Sullivan County, served in the local militia under Captain Bazile Tyler's company of scouts as an Indian spy, and Captain DeWitt's company of rangers between 1775 and 1778. In 1776, he was captured by Indians, perhaps Senecas, but escaped with the help of Tory neighbor Mrs. Bryant Kane. She and her children were killed and scalped, probably in retribution. In 1778, Conklin enlisted in Mamakating, New York, as a volunteer in Captain Peter Mill's company of Colonel Judithan Baldwin's Continental Army Regiment of Artillery Artificers. It's a long mouthful. Artificer is a craftsman, so he helped maintain the guns. He was promoted to sergeant in 1780 and was stationed at West Point when Benedict Arnold took command of the post. He was later stationed at Dobbs Ferry across the river from Tappan and was sergeant of the guard at the execution of British spy and Arnold accomplice, Major John Andre. Conklin was honorably discharged in 1781. In 1817, he and fellow Baldwin Regiment artificer Joseph Thomas resettled in Conklin, Broome County, New York, and Thomas just across the border in Pennsylvania. Orange and James Stoddard. I always like that name, Orange. Orange Stoddard was born in Litchfield, Connecticut, but moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts a decade before the American Revolution began. Stoddard served as second lieutenant in Colonel John Patterson's Minutemen and marched to Cambridge just days after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Between 1777 and 1779, he was a captain in Colonel Joseph Vose's regiment, which fought at the Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey in 1778. From late 1779 to the end of 1780, Stoddard was a captain in the 1st Massachusetts Regiment. After the war, he became a general in the Massachusetts militia and became a member of the Masons. General Stoddard was one of the original members of the Boston Purchase Company and was appointed one of the commissioners to treaty with the Indians for cession of their title to the land that became the Boston 10 Towns in 1786. He moved there in 1788, settling in what is now Endwell, near Gray's Crossing, not far from Washingtonian Hall. After his wife died in 1810, he moved to the area that is now Whitney Point, where he died in 1824. The general is buried there in Riverside Cemetery. James Stoddard remained in Litchfield, Connecticut, and had a very different experience from his brother, Orange. In June 1775, his militia company marched from Farmington, Massachusetts to Boston and was I knew that was coming. Stoddard remained in Litchfield and had a very different experience from his brother. In June of 1775, his company marched from Farmington, Massachusetts to Boston and was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, as well as the early days of the Siege of Boston. In 1776, he was stationed at Dorchester Heights during the Siege of Boston. In August of that year, as a captain in Colonel Fisher Gay's regiment, James was ordered to New York, but the regiment was driven back by the British at Kingsbridge, New York, where they remained until November. In early September 1777, his regiment marched to Bemis Heights and helped oppose the British at Saratoga the following month. His pension states that he wrapped the wound, and at the time Benedict, I'm not reading this right, his pension states that he wrapped the wound of Benedict Arnold in his cloak and returned him to his quarters. In 1781 and 1782, he was commissioned a captain by Connecticut Governor Jonathan Trumbull, during which he guarded the coast in lines between Horseneck, or Greenwich, and Stamford, Connecticut, and New York City, protecting the local population from Tory and British foraging parties, skirmishing and retrieving cattle at times. In 1793 or 94, James decided to join his brother Orange in Tioga County, New York. He settled several miles north of his brother in what would become the town of Nanticoke. James became an associate judge and then the first judge in the new Broome County's Court of Common Pleas. He died there in 1837. Joshua Mercereau was a graduate of King's College, now Columbia University, a New York City lawyer, and his brother John, a successful tavern and stagecoach line and boat fleet operator in the town of Old Blazing Star on Staten Island before the Revolution. The brothers also originated the postal stage route from Philadelphia to New York. As the war started, Joshua and his brother were forced to move to Woodbridge, New Jersey, leaving their homes and businesses behind. The brothers were also close friends of George Washington and helped to establish the Mercereau spy ring. Joshua's son, John LaGrange Mercereau, was an agent on Staten Island during the British occupation. Check out the founding fathers of the American intelligence on the CIA's webpage to read more about this. Joshua represented Richmond County of Staten Island in the New York Provincial Assembly. He was Quartermaster General of the New York State Troops and became Deputy Commissary of Prisoners on Washington's staff. Joshua, with his brother John, were said to have prevented the British Army from crossing the Delaware River in the pursuit of the Continental Army as it retreated across New Jersey in December 1776 by ensuring that the last of the boats that could be used to transport the British across the river, including 2 hidden Durham boats, sunk by a loyalist who lived nearby. After the surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga, General Mercereau had charge of all prisoners. After the war, he moved to Unadilla, but soon thereafter moved to the area of Vestal in 1789, and then across the river to Union. Joshua was an early agent for the Hooper-Wilson patent and became a district judge for Tioga County. He died in 1804 at 70 years of age and is buried in Riverside Cemetery in Endicott. His brother, John, died in 1820 and is buried in the same plot nearby. William McClure signed the Association of Test in 1775 while he was teaching in Stottsburg, just south of Rhinebeck, in Dutchess County. In the ensuing years, McClure mustered into various militia units and levies in Dutchess and Orange counties. In 1778, he enlisted in a company of the 2nd Regiment of the New York Continental Line, commanded by Colonel Philip Van Cortlandt. His regiment marched from Orange County through eastern Pennsylvania to join up with Washington's army at Valley Forge. While at Valley Forge, his education and language skills sent him away from his regiment on various duties that involved the storehouse and the Department of Hides. In 1787, William built a surveyor's office close to the Delaware River's West Branch in Coos, with now Deposit. He also built a cabin 5 miles west of there in what would become known as McClure's Settlement.
I think we better.
Yeah, and that was my last
All
slide.
right.
That's why I was worried.
Thank you so much, Mark. That we don't hear about Broome County's role in the American Revolution. We have time for some questions, Mark.
My wife has got an ancestor that's Mohawk, and I always was wondering about the Mohawks splitting away from the rest of the Iroquois Confederacy, because that split them up, didn't it?
Want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was about how the Mohawk split away from and the Seneca.
It kind of split up the Iroquois Confederacy, didn't it?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that question really well, but I agree that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy really got broken up. I would say most at the Battle of. Now I'm going to draw a blank. Somebody help me. No, not Newtown. Up by Fort Stanwix there. Oriskany, thank you. Oriskany, yes.
Yeah.
The Battle of Oriskany was kind of a turning point, as I understand it, for the Haudenosaunee people, and the Mohawk and Seneca tended to side more with the British allies, whereas the Oneida and the Tuscarora tended to side more with the American side. Yes, sir.
Didn't some of that go back to a treaty that was done by that Sir William Johnson in Albany area? maybe 25, 30 years before that.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's, that's why I said I'm not the best person to answer that kind of a question, but the statement made was, didn't that go back to a treaty that Sir William Johnson was involved in a number of years earlier? And I'm sure that all contributed to the way it all worked out in the end. Yeah.
You had a slide earlier of two plaques, I think, and one was the grave, when the two armies came together and Union got its name. Where are those plaques?
Well, let's see if I can find it here.
I'd like to go see them. There they are.
Yeah. So the one that says Union on the right, that is not far past where 26 goes north again off of Main Street. It was a CVS. Is it still a CVS right there?
What community?
In Union, in Endicott. Yeah. So it's
Presbyterian Church.
Near where Pat Mitchell's ice cream used to be.
no, it's further down than that.
There's a church down there.
Yeah. If I could bring up Google Maps, I could show you. But it's if you head down Main Street towards the Union District of Endicott, it's right on Main Street, not far from where the CVS is or used to be.
Walgreens.
Is it Walgreens now? Okay.
And how about
The Indian Castle one, I believe that is the Otsiningo. That's an Otsiningo sign. It might be on Upper Front Street.
By law.
Yeah, right, yeah, not just, right at, actually, it's very close to the Lowe's parking lot. Right. And then that bottom one was just reinstalled, I don't know, about 10 years ago by the DAR, and it's at Confluence Park, right near the South Washington Street Bridge.
The walking bridge.
Right.
Is there another question, Mark?
Yes, sir.
That 1797 map you showed earlier,
Yes.
I noted at the bottom, below the Susquehanna River, it said graveyard. Do you have any idea where that might
I
be?
do not know. That
Curious.
one there.
Yeah.
Yes, I see it says graveyard. I don't know if Roger has any more insight into that graveyard.
Where is it on the map?
It's
Right on the south side, just up from the confluence. About where Crowley would be, maybe?
yeah, probably, or a Park Diner, somewhere in that vicinity. I do not know what that would have been.
I've seen it on the map, but
Another question?
Well, thank you, Mark, once again. Very thorough presentation. It was nice to see some of those names, Conklin and Mersrow and Whitney, names we are familiar with, traced back to veterans of the American Revolution who moved here from many different places. So thanks for informing us. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. The Broome County Historical Society has one meeting left for our 24-25 year. And that is next month. We're always the third Wednesday of the month. And instead of meeting in this room, we will be meeting in the Phelps Mansion Museum Ballroom, which is right next door. So you can still park in the library parking lot, a small lot behind the museum, or certainly on the street. Our speaker will be Michael Engel, and he's going to talk about the history of diners, not people, but the buildings, diners in Broome County and the Southern Tier, starting from the 1890s, what were called wagon trucks, bringing us up to date, those silver diners of the 1950s, and then the more modern, very palatial ones at one time. Some of them even had a 10-page menu.
So I think you will enjoy next month's meeting as much as we all enjoyed this month's meeting. So thank you all for coming. I hope the rain has stopped by now. Enjoy the rest of your evening.